Hello and welcome to India's World. Today we are going to discuss the referendum for independence in Scotland. Scotland was a free country from the 2nd century AD till the early 18th century. The Acts of the Union of 1707 brought Scotland and England into a union under Queen Anne. Despite the union, however, many Scots have continued to dream of full sovereignty. The current movement for independence is being led by the Scottish National Party, or the SNP, which was founded in 1934. The SNP has been represented in British Parliament at Westminster since 1967. After a separate Scottish Parliament was formed in 1999, the SNP served as the main opposition party for the first two terms of that Parliament. Since 2007, however, it has led the government in Scotland. If the Scots vote for independence, then besides redefining its relationship with Scotland as a sovereign country, the UK will lose 32% of its land and 8% of its population. That the UK is allowing the referendum and that both sides have agreed to accept the outcome without any rancor is considered highly unusual by many in the world. To discuss the consequences of this unusual Scottish referendum for independence, we have with us three distinguished guests. We have with us Mr. Adam Roberts, an old friend. He is a South Asia Bureau Chief for The Economist, based in New Delhi. Ambassador Shiv Mukherjee. He was India's High Commissioner to the UK and was earlier High Commissioner to South Africa, Ambassador to Nepal and Egypt. And Ambassador Nalin Surie, he followed Ambassador Mukherjee as High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and has also served as India's Ambassador to China and Poland. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Adam, let me begin with you.
Sure.
As I said, this is a very unusual event.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the history of the world, the United States fought a civil war to become a union. Turkey fought the Kurds and till today denies them the right for even Kurdish language education. Kosovo became a free country after nearly a decade of fighting. Russia has chosen to crush separatists in Chechnya and Dagestan. We in India get upset when any section of our population talks about self-determination. So why have the British agreed so peacefully to let the Scots decide whether they want to become independent or not?
Well, I'd put it in another context, which is that both the European Union context makes it easier to imagine leaving the sovereign embrace, in a way, of the United Kingdom, because you're not leaving entirely behind the institutions of the European Union. But I'd also look at the tradition of democracy, the fact that institutions have been around for a long time in this part of Europe. And for all the examples that you cite, and they're all absolutely accurate and good ones, I could cite back to one or two peaceful examples of secession, such as Norway leaving Sweden. And it happened very peacefully, and it happened in a similar sort of good-natured process. So it's not entirely unheard of, in Europe at least, to have this sort of peaceful, democratic, mature process.
Okay. Ambassador Mukherjee, how did the Scottish referendum come about? And why did David Cameron agree to it in the Edinburgh Agreement he signed with Alex Salmond?
Well, as Adam said, I think the democratic institutions, the background of the relationship within Great Britain, of Scotland and England, made it extremely difficult for somebody to actually oppose it, and legally or otherwise. In fact, British policy towards Northern Ireland has been the same, that if Northern Ireland, a majority of Northern Ireland decides to join the Irish Republic, then it could do so. So I think it is probably the best thing that could have happened, that reluctantly or otherwise, they followed, both sides have followed a constitutional methodology towards possible separation. I mean, it remains to be seen how the vote goes. But you've already had a devolution of powers to the Scottish Parliament. If the vote is yes, there'll be a further transference of sovereignty to the Scottish Parliament pending full independence. Okay, so it's the right way to go.
Yeah, let me take that question actually to Ambassador Surie. In 1999, because of a yes vote, the Scots got a parliament of their own. And Tony Blair was the man who was responsible for that referendum. He was the Prime Minister, let's say, at that time. Now, did Tony Blair not realize that this was only a halfway house to separation? So clearly, this referendum wouldn't have come as a surprise to the Brits, because the ground was already being prepared from 1999 onwards.
I think you raise a very fundamental point and a very correct one. Because irrespective of the outcome of the referendum, I think the process of devolution will go on. And because of the concessions that London is making under pressure just to make sure that the no vote wins, the extent of devolution will be very substantial. And you cannot then stop with Scotland, even if there's a no vote. Then it has to go to Northern Ireland, it will go to Wales. So, but I think to come back to your basic point, you have to look at the Union of Nations which took place in 1707. The system recognizes that this was an independent nation, country, whatever you want to call it in those days. So, in a way, going back to the past is what is happening. And I think what Tony Blair did was simply recognize the reality on the ground. There was also, I think, the compulsions of local politics. I think the tax which Mrs. Thatcher had brought in earlier when she was in power, which was introduced in Scotland before it was introduced in the rest of the country. So Scots felt, why are we being taxed? We have no role to play in this. We had no participation in the process which led to this taxation. So I think it's a series of issues and events which happened. You can't just put your finger on one single thing.
It wasn't a minor calculation, a political calculation on part of Tony Blair that Labour Party is sibling the Scottish Labour Party, which sent the majority of the MPs at that point of time to Westminster, and ran the government for 2 terms after Scottish Parliament was formed, that these people would be there in perpetuity because after all it will be a Labour government.
See, that's the fun of democracy, Just because you won elections in a particular year does not mean you're going to win them indefinitely. And I think that is where the strength of the Scottish National Party has been. It's taken them, almost 70 years to get to this point. And to my mind, irrespective of the outcome of the referendum, I mean, the system will change.
Yeah.
The nature of the union will change.
Adam, is the demand for independence more emotional one? Or is it really a rational one which says that, this will take government closer to the people and it will be better for the Scottish people?
I think there's an element of rationality in there. Scotland had a lot of oil. It saw pumped out of the North Sea in the last 20 years. The opportunity to be a great economic power like Norway, for example, was there. There are parts of the Scottish economy that might flourish if it was an independent niche expert in finance or other areas. But in fact, most of the campaign is emotional, it is nationalist, it's about appealing to young voters. The fact that 16 and 17-year-olds are allowed to vote in this referendum suggests to me that it's more of an appeal to the heart than the head.
And 97% of the population is registered to vote in
There's
the
great
referendum.
enthusiasm. A lot of Scots are very, very keen to vote in this. A lot of Scots who don't live in Scotland, for example, a large Scottish population in London, are not allowed to vote, and they're very angry. And they would, I suspect, be voting against independence. They would like to be part of this election, but they can't be.
Okay. Mr. Mukherjee, how much time would take between a yes vote, if there is a yes vote, and Scotland actually becoming independent?
Well, they've already set a date, which is March of 2016, which is the 9th or 7th anniversary of the Union of 1707. So the date is already set, and given the time frame, given the fact that you are talking about 2 nations with a highly developed democracy, they should be able to stick to the date, provided the vote goes in the yes direction.
All right. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing the referendum for Scottish independence and its possible consequences. Ambassador Surie, what will be the role of British royalty in independent Scotland? Because the Scottish National Party is not a Republican party, and they say that independent Scotland will continue to share the Queen as head of the state, as 16 Commonwealth countries already do. This is what their site on the net says. But Alex Salmond, the First Minister for Scotland, says that he would like Queen Elizabeth to be the Queen of the Scots, like some of our ancestors were monarchs of Scotland. Buckingham Palace has stepped in a certain way, but do you think that is the correct reaction?
Well, I think what is being affected by this referendum is the Union of Nations of 1707. The Union of Crowns of 1603 is not affected. So, irrespective of what Mrs. Salmond may want or does not want, I mean, the way I see it legally, Her Majesty remains the Queen of Scotland.
Then should she have said that people should think about the vote very carefully? What does it mean?
Well, you can interpret it either way, but I would give Her Majesty the benefit of the doubt. Because she spends a lot of time in Scotland. I think it's very clear that she will remain Queen of Scotland. She would ideally, obviously, like to remain Queen of a united kingdom, not a kingdom which is divided. And I think this feeling of hers was made known, certainly while I was posted in London, the message had gone across that I was crowned Queen of, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. But that is the way Her Majesty functions. She sends out these half messages, and I think people who understand them.
He's being careful, I suppose.
She has to be, given her constitutional position. Yeah.
Adam, if there's a yes vote, what would be the nature of Scotland's relationship with UK? Will the two countries be a free trade zone, a free travel zone? Would there be a currency union? The governor of Bank of England, Michael Carney, has said that currency union is incompatible with sovereignty. Seems like almost a veiled threat. So what kind of complications might the separation create?
Well, it's one of the remarkable aspects of this campaign is we don't really know exactly what it would look like if Scotland went independent. On the side of the no campaign, they say, well, Scotland cannot have the pound. The pound is British, and the British government would not support the Scottish economy. The yes campaign says, no, we can keep the pound. It's quite possible to be in a currency union. So these sorts of things have to be worked out. But I think it's quite clear that there is uncertainty about what comes next. Investors don't like that. A lot of companies will leave Scotland and go to the rest of Britain instead.
Ambassador Mukherjee, isn't there a lesson from the Euro crisis that, currency unions without political unions don't really work? That if you don't control your own currency, you risk being held hostage to the economic policies of other countries whose currency you use.
Well, it's a judgment call. I mean, the euro has been through it all, and yet the euro survives. Sometimes it flourishes, sometimes it does not. But, you accept a certain amount of uncertainty in something like the currency union because of certain advantages you get in other areas of your national aspirations. So I wouldn't say it's an unmixed blessing. I wouldn't say it's an unmixed disaster either. I mean, they can go one of three ways. They can stick to the euro as the Scottish National Party wanted to do earlier. They can have their own currency, or they can persist with the British pound. Whatever choice they make will go through a transition period of a certain amount of, uncertainty and so on. And at that time, it'll be up to them to go through it, as other nations have done.
I don't think it's entirely up to them whether they keep the pound. I think the British might decide not to let them have it.
They could keep the pound if the British decide to let them have it, and the British might. So these are the three options open to them.
But they're threatening right now.
If the vote is yes, I don't think these are the key economic issues which you raise. These are the fundamental issues. But I don't see them as a real danger to Scotland.
Okay.
Pound is printed in Scotland also, even now.
Yeah, it's called the Scottish pound, but...
the pound is printed both in England, the currency note, in England and in Scotland even now. I think a lot of these issues are being overplayed. A certain amount of fear factor is being built.
By either side.
If you look at the history of the end of the Cold War and the strategies followed by the democratic countries of former Eastern Europe, you'll find that a lot of them have gone through major shock therapy and come out of it very well. And Scotland will not face that kind of shock therapy. It's part of a very well-developed capitalist economic system. And I think the fears are being overplayed. But there's a method behind this madness. I mean, if the no campaign wants to use any factor that it can use to ensure that voters vote no. I think it's a fair call in a referendum.
The Bank of England
like
should not have joined the no campaign. I mean, he's not a political person.
He's a Canadian for a start.
Exactly.
Exactly. But let me ask you a slightly different question, Adam. What would happen to Scotland's national security? Would the British Army and its assets be equally divided or divided in proportion to population? And what would happen to the Trident submarines?
Well, that's a great concern.
They are in Scottish waters, and Scotland says that an independent Scotland would have nothing to do with nuclear weapons, either storing them or using them or manufacturing them.
Well, I think for Britain it's a great concern. As you say, the nuclear weapons are kept in Scotland. It's where we have the base. I suspect that despite what the nationalists say, for at least a transition period, the British would be happy to pay the Scottish to continue to host that facility until it's ready to move them south of the border. As for Scotland's own defence, I mean, in a world in Europe where Russia is much more aggressive, where there's a great deal more uncertainty, I think nobody in Britain would want to leave Scotland vulnerable or open to any pressure from other countries. So there would be every incentive to keep Scotland within NATO and to keep Scotland within the same defence umbrella that it already exists within.
Why do you think, Ambassador Mukherjee, that the no campaign has moved from a campaign focused on advantages, better together, to a sort of more negative and a complicated campaign, where Sometimes you're promoting greater devolution, sometimes you're heightening Scottish insecurities by saying if you do this, these are the bad things that will happen to you. Do you think this strategy is working in the favor of the no campaign, or do you think it will work in favor of the yes campaign?
My personal opinion is the latter. I'll tell you why. I think, when you're talking of something that has existed mostly happily for 300 years and you suddenly see it ending, when you're at a distance from it, you think it'll never happen, which is why the shrillness of the opposition to the yes campaign in England wasn't all that high, if you go back 8 or 10 or 15 years. But recently, when the polls showed that the yes campaign was, gaining tremendous ground, and the polls showed that it's almost neck and neck, it's almost half and half, I think it resulted in the kind of fear among those who want the union to stay, that something really, really untoward was going to happen. And so I think it led to an overreaction of not just pointing out the difficulties that independent Scotland would have to go through, but almost scaremongering. And I think it helps the yes campaign, because what it does, given the background of nationalism that exists in every nation or would-be nation, it's putting up the backs of those, even those who are sitting on the fence. If you hector somebody or try to scare him into a particular state of mind, which goes against his, like Adam rightly talked about the emotional content.
But the no campaign is in panic then?
The yes campaign is being helped by the no campaign, which is in a bit of a panic.
All right. Okay. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the referendum for Scottish independence and its consequences. Ambassador Surie, if Scotland's 59 seats in Parliament, in British Parliament, disappear, what impact might it have on future British governments? And which political party is expected to gain because of this or lose because of this?
Well, actually, it's difficult to say in the sense that, the Conservatives have not been traditionally strong in Scotland. Labour has been, but of late, even Labour is not strong in Scotland. So it's difficult to say what impact this will have. But I think if Scotland decides to go away, there will be an impact on the elections in Britain next year, I believe. What that impact would be, you can argue it both ways, but I suspect that the Labour will use this as an argument against the Tories, saying that, because you have no support in Scotland, you didn't bother enough, and your last-ditch efforts were not enough.
Adam, let's talk about Scotland and the European Union. Yeah. Scotland wants to be in the European Union, there's no doubt about it. The question is, how does it join the European Union? Now, people are talking about two mechanisms. That does Scotland join European Union in an internal manner through Article 48, where, some amendments to the treaties of the European Union are made, adopted, and Scotland comes in, because Scotland, as part of Britain, was already part of EU. There are others, especially in those people in the no campaign, they say, look, this is not possible. That you have to apply afresh as a new country. And that's a long and laborious process where you have to apply to the European Council, European Parliament, or notify your national parliament, and so on and so forth, in a much longer process. Is this again scaremongering, or do you think Scotland can join under Article 48?
Well, my guess is that if the vote is yes, and once Scotland is an independent country, it's then in the interest of the rest of Britain to have as prosperous and successful a neighbour as possible. And so the rest of Britain would want, I think, to help Scotland become a member of the European Union fairly painlessly and smoothly in order to benefit both sides. So I would imagine that this is scaremongering more than otherwise. But it's not only up to Britain. I think it's up to the rest of Europe to decide what sort of precedent it wants to set, because after Britain comes the possibility of secession from Spain and from other countries. So what sort of example does the European Union want to see established in how members can join and rejoin the European Union?
So it's an issue not only for the British, but also for the European Union.
I think it's an issue for the world. It goes way beyond Europe.
Yeah.
It goes
so
to every country.
let me take that question to Ambassador Mukherjee. Now, people from Catalonia to Kurdistan to Quebec, the Flemish, they're all looking at what happens in the Scottish referendum. So what might the outcome of the Scottish referendum on independence have on these movements for independence in the rest of the world?
I think
much beyond Europe.
I think the the fact of Scotland breaking away from a union and becoming an independent country and the impact it will have on other separatist movements of particular regions wanting to be independent, I think it's exaggerated. Not that the aspirations are exaggerated, I'm saying the impact of this particular event is exaggerated because those movements stand on their own feet and their own logic. They've been strong or weak or, long-standing or not so long-standing. And each has to be, I think, looked at, by itself.
But there'll be a precedent that
There'll
these
be a
things can be
precedent
done
in terms
peacefully.
of what happens afterwards. Let's say you spoke of the European Union. Depending on how it goes, the Scottish application for membership, which way it takes, how long it takes, yes, it'll have but that's what I would call, not any kind of dangerous precedent. It's a question of time. It's a question of technicality.
I'm not talking about danger, but let me ask you this, Ambassador Surie. There are busloads of Catalans, South Tyroleans, Corsicans, Bretons, Finland Swedes, all kinds of people from various independence movements who are headed to Scotland to witness this referendum. Even Bavaria, which calls itself Europe's 7th largest economy, has sent a delegation to watch the election. Do you agree with Ambassador Mukherjee it will have no impact? Because could one argue that irrespective of the outcome, whether the Scots vote for independence or they don't vote for independence, the process itself would have impacted nationalist movements everywhere?
Well, you can always argue that case, but I don't think the case is very strong because the manner in which it's happening in Britain, the manner in which if Scotland separates from Britain is so legal, is so constitutional, is so based on consensus amongst the principal parties and the entire nation. After all, look, the process of devolution, as we started at the very beginning of this conversation, started in the last century. And if you allow devolution, then you are logically prepared to allow that process to go further. Now, what is happening in Britain today is absolutely legal, above board, and by consensus. Now, if the same situation happens in some other situation, maybe the impact can be the same.
But then should we go by the constitution or by the will of the people?
But in Britain, the two are the same, isn't it? There is no written constitution. But once Westminster has agreed to a certain process, and you're following the process, then you are constitutionally right. So what is happening in Britain is constitutional.
So it doesn't depend on a written constitution.
Well, Britain is run without a written constitution.
So you can't have it both ways.
No, you can. Of course you can.
So will of the people is important, you're saying?
Well, the will of the people is reflected through acts of parliament and decisions of parliament.
And traditions.
There is no tradition involved over here. In this case, it's all legal. It's all above board, from what I understand. I mean, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I think what is happening is completely constitutional.
Right. But I think if you get beyond the mere fact of the letter of the law, and instead you look at what people understand in a globalized world where all the information is shared easily, a Tibetan in China, a Kashmiri in India, there are many of those around the world who would hope to have the same sort of opportunities the Scots are being given today within Britain to think about becoming independent themselves.
They already think of that. The point is,
and this sets a strong precedent for them to follow.
I don't think so. I don't really think so, because I think you have to be. You're a creature of what you're part of, and you can't
individual
just
histories matter. Individual contexts matter.
You can't just extract an example from somewhere and put it on your.
But let me ask you a more general question, because if you cut too close to the bone, people get hurt. So let me ask you this, Ambassador Mukherjee.
No, but we should cut close to the bone. I see no problem with that. I mean, really.
Well, I'm coming to you. So go ahead and be a surgeon. But Ambassador Mukherjee, do you think that national self-determination or self-determination of a people, of an ethnicity, or what subnationality, does it bring government and policies closer to the people? And is it therefore a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Sorry, you mean whether a support for ethnicity and a support for self-determination?
No, allowing self-determination could be for separation, could be for greater devolution. But the principle of self-determination, that people decide their own fate, is it good or bad? And what is good about it and what is bad about it?
Well, it's like motherhood. I mean, in the one sense, it's like motherhood. I mean, nobody can argue against the desire for self-determination of a people. But then, in today's world, which is a world divided by nation-states, you come up against trouble if you interpret that, in a completely open-ended way. I mean, you talked about the American Civil War and Union. I mean, everybody thinks that, most people think that Abraham Lincoln took a moral stand against slavery. He did nothing of that sort. In that letter he wrote to Greeley, He said that I would free the slaves, or I would free half the slaves, or I would free no slaves at all, but I must save the union.
All right, but
So
we're running out of time.
You have to look at the context.
We're running out of
You have
time.
to look at the
Last
context.
word to you. You want to cut close to the bone. Please go ahead and tell me about self-determination.
No, I think self-determination depends on how you interpret it. Self-determination is normally interpreted in international law in terms of a process leading to independence, to sovereignty. And sovereignty does not necessarily mean good governance, to answer your question. So, I think what we are talking about here is a certain constitutional process being followed in its entirety by consensus, not just consensus, by actual formal agreement. Now, if those conditions are replicated somewhere else, then I think nobody can stand in the way. After all, look what happened. I'll give you, Adam took the example of Norway and Sweden. Let me take you to the example of the Czech and Slovaks.
The Velvet divorce.
The Velvet divorce. I mean, look at what happened since the breakup of the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union was legally 15 independent republics which came together. And Gorbachev allowed first the Baltics to go. So what I'm trying to say, these are all constitutional processes. And as long as the process is constitutional, I think people will have to accept it.
Fine.
And in the case of Scotland, there's been no violence, there's been no bloodshed, there's no been firing of bullets, there's been no civil disturbance. Right. This is why I think it's closer to the Velvet divorce.
We're running out of time. Yeah. So what I understand from this is that it's a one-off process,
yes,
from which no larger lessons are to be learned.
No, the larger lessons.
No,
there are lessons. The larger lessons are that if a section of your population feels dissatisfied or disenfranchised, you need to look after their interests.
All right. We've really run out of time, so I'd like to thank all of you, Ambassador Nalin Surie, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, Mr. Adam Roberts, for coming here and discussing this complicated issue for our viewers. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week with another interesting issue. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching.